have, we have two official languages. We have English and Maori. And it's often our custom in New Zealand to begin with a Maori greeting. And that is what I would like to do this evening. So tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai, ki te rōpū Kiwis in LA me a tātou hoa Amerika. Ka nui te mihi atu kia koutou katoa. Nā mihi nui ki te tangata whenua o tēnei whenua te iwi tongwa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And what I have done here is to greet the members of Kiwis in LA and our American friends who have joined us this evening. And then it's a Maori custom to acknowledge the tribe on whose land you reside. And so therefore the North American people, the Native American people in Los Angeles are the Tongva. So I have acknowledged them in my greeting. But it's my very great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Rosemary Banks, New Zealand Ambassador to the US. The interests of New Zealanders on the West Coast are very ably served by the New Zealand Consulate General and New Zealand Trade and Enterprise Office in Los Angeles. And I believe we have our Consul General, Jeremy Clark Watson, on the call with us today. But being on the West Coast, it is not very often that we have a chance to have contact with our embassy. So we very much appreciate your making time, Ambassador, to be with us today. Rosemary and I have known one another for many years, in fact, since 1975. That year, we were both members of a group of recent graduates who joined the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Rosemary's early years were spent in the UN and Commonwealth divisions, and while mine were in the South Pacific and Asia. But nonetheless, being part of the same class, we did see one another often, both professionally and personally. However, our journeys took us on very different paths. I left Foreign Affairs after a posting to Tokyo and came to live in the US, while Rosemary continued and has had a storied career with the New Zealand Foreign Service. She has been permanent representative to the UN, ambassador to France and Portugal, and New Zealand's permanent representative to the OECD. She served as Deputy Chief of Mission in Honiara and Canberra, and she was also our permanent representative to the OECD. She has had senior positions in Wellington, including Deputy Secretary responsible for multilateral, legal, and consular affairs. Rosemary also served as Crown negotiator for the Treaty of Waitangi settlement process, and as such, I believe is uniquely qualified to answer questions many of you may have about New Zealand. When I learned that Rosemary was ambassador to the US, I knew that we were in very capable hands. And I also approached Rosemary and asked if she would be open to a happy hour chat with members of Kiwis in LA. And so she very graciously agreed to be with us today. Rosemary is going to speak with us about the political and economic relationship between New Zealand and the US. We will then open the floor for questions, and I know there are many. Rosemary is happy to take questions from the informal to those relating to New Zealand's place in the world today. I should also say that while Rosemary's opening remarks will be recorded and posted on our social media, once we go into the question and answer period, we will cease recording. I would ask those of you who have questions to type them into the chat, and you'll be messaged directly to be ready to unmute so that we may call on you to present your questions in person to Rosemary. It is therefore my very great pleasure to represent Kiwis in LA in giving Rosemary our warmest welcome, and I very much look forward to her remarks and our subsequent conversation. And with that, I'd like to give the floor to Ambassador Banks.
Enga mana, enga reo, e rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. no mai haere mai ki tēnei hui, whakapiri mai, whakatata mai, nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa, which is welcome everybody and an acknowledgement of all our honoured friends. So, although we're far apart, I'm inviting you in Te Reo to be close, to draw near. Now, we've had to learn all sorts of things digitally over the past year, but I don't think we can quite bridge that gap between the East Coast and the West Coast. Never mind, we'll do our best in this conversation. So may I first acknowledge in particular your President, Vaughan Cottier, and the immediate past President, Keith Fleming. Very grateful for the invitation to be with you this evening, and a particular delight to be reunited with my former colleague and friend, Hilary Brick. She didn't add that, of course, we were only both aged 12 when we joined our foreign ministry as exceptionally young and talented people. Also delighted that Jeremy Clark-Watson, Consul General in Los Angeles, is able to be on the call tonight. And I'm sure that I have the right to pass all the questions that are difficult over to Jeremy when we get to the Q&A. So what I'd like to cover in my opening remarks is just a few things. First up, the enduring qualities, the enduring dimensions of our long-standing friendship and partnership between New Zealand and the United States. Secondly, what are the particular priorities that we're looking to achieve with the Biden administration? Thirdly, just to touch on a couple of new and interesting areas of our cooperation that don't immediately jump to mind. And lastly, to consider the impacts of the pandemic, which of course have been so deep in every aspect of our lives, both professional and personal. First up on the sort of the nature and the bedrock foundations of the US-New Zealand relationship goes actually back further than most people realize. In fact, the first US consul was posted to New Zealand in 1839, a chap called James Clendon. We've actually got a pencil sketch of him on the wall in the residence, and he looks a fairly grim item, but you probably had to be in those days to deal with a bunch of unruly sailors and whalers and the like. It's a bit lost in our history that he would have been an observer, he was an observer of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, and he would have certainly been present that same year when the first official ship visit, US ship visit to New Zealand came through. That was the USS Vincennes, and it was returning from a trip down to discover the passage to the Antarctica, carrying the Wilkes expedition. It's a fascinating story in itself if you've got time at some point to look up the Wilkes expedition on the website. Those early contacts have, as I say, been a little bit lost in the fog of history rather than the fog of war, but nonetheless, they laid a very firm foundation for the very strong and lasting friendship that we now enjoy. There were a number of interesting contacts throughout the 19th century, actually, and there was even an American dimension to the fact that New Zealand women got the right to vote in 1893. Now, this I learned from a book of New Zealand women in history. Some of you may have already heard the story, but it's not very well known. A very feisty woman who was a member of the Christian Temperance Union called Mary Levitt sailed from San Francisco in 1884, and her purpose to take to New Zealand a message about suffrage for women, but also, of course, the primary message about temperance. So she toured the country, and apparently she was responsible for setting up of a whole network of women's organizations, which later became the fabric that sustained our suffragette movement. So we took very quickly to the suffrage message, but we were evidently a little resistant to the temperance message. That didn't quite have the same appeal. So on a more serious note, other enduring aspects or dimensions of the relationship, of course, are our shared values of democracy, freedom for individual rights, freedom of the press, all of those things that we actually rather take for granted until they're somewhat threatened, which it seems in the current age, some of those are. The other long history that it binds us is that of our defence and security cooperation. I always remind our American friends and colleagues that New Zealand, I know Australia makes a big deal out of this, but actually New Zealand has fought alongside the US in every major conflict since World War I. And like Australia, we even actually helped to train American soldiers in World War I to get them used to trench warfare. But that's another whole story, and we won't go there. So just finishing off, the things that don't change from one administration to the next about our relationship, the sort of permanent dimensions, of course, the trade, economic and investment aspect is also immensely important, and getting more so, especially in the current times when the messages are going very clearly to the New Zealand business community that they need to diversify away from any one market becoming too important, and I think you'll guess which one I'm referring to. So let me turn now to the engagement that New Zealand wants to have with the Biden administration. Of course, with every change, there's a shift in policy. Sometimes that opens new opportunities, sometimes it makes it more difficult to achieve objectives. In this case, there is a really close alignment of priorities and values between our government in New Zealand and the Biden team. And when we put to our ministers back in January, around about the time of the inauguration, some proposals and recommendations and ideas for what our priorities for engaging with the Biden administration should be, they selected and came back with 4 key objectives. The first one is one that we would share with probably every country around the world at the moment. What can we do together on pandemic recovery and helping our economies to recover? Secondly, big one for New Zealand and very big one for the Biden administration, and that is climate change. And you might have seen that Prime Minister Ardern already had quite a central role in the President Biden's climate summit just a few weeks ago. Our third objective is rather an enduring one, but it's got new emphasis with the Biden team, and that is stability in our Indo-Pacific region. And we interpret that particularly in terms of what's happening in the Pacific Islands region, our nearest neighbourhood, and a neighbourhood of growing concern. And then the fourth objective was to work as closely as possible with the US to help it to restore strength and dynamism to the multilateral organisations that smaller countries like New Zealand depend on, like the World Trade Organization, like the World Health Organization. In summary, we are very pleased to see and hear the messages from the Biden White House that America is back, that America is back to engaging very actively in a global role. But, and there are always some areas that you can't do as well or get as far on as you hope you might. And one of those, we suspect, is going to be our hopes for an improved trade and economic relationship. Our previous government was very keen to press the idea of a free trade agreement with the United States. We're the only Five Eyes partner that doesn't have one or have one in the process of negotiation. But we're realistic. That's looking politically quite difficult at the moment. So it may be that we have to wait a bit longer. Speaking of waiting, we actually, and here's another little dive back into our history, we actually first raised the idea of an improved trade agreement or an improved trade relationship with the United States in 1870. Then New Zealand Premier William Fox wrote to the US consul of that time and made a case for tariff-free access to the US market for New Zealand wool, which of course was one of our probably our major export after the gold ran out. History doesn't really reveal what response we got, but evidently it wasn't very encouraging because there was a long pause, and then in 1939, then Minister of Finance, Walter Nash, on his way back from a trip to London, called into Washington and again put the case to President Roosevelt that New Zealand would benefit, and he made a very strong argument for what he called then a reciprocal trade agreement. So interesting bits of history, but 80 years later, and we're still waiting and hoping. But we do tell our friends in the American administration and the trade areas that we're very patient and we're very persistent, and we'll keep on coming back to it. So just turning briefly to some less traditional, more recent areas of our bilateral cooperation. And one of these is really surprising to most Americans, and that is that there is now a very active relationship between New Zealand and the US in space cooperation. Now, probably being on the West Coast, you would, many of you or all of you, be well aware of the once New Zealand company Rocket Lab. Only a dozen or more years ago started off, almost the startup in a garage story in Auckland, and is now a very significant US company with a New Zealand subsidiary, and launching rockets with small payloads of small satellites into space from New Zealand, but soon to also open a US launch base in Virginia at Wallops Beach. So since early 2019, Rocket Lab has had 19 successful launch missions, and in that period they've launched now just over 100 small satellites, including for NASA, for the US Air Force, for DARPA, and other US agencies. And that's all been possible because, as a trusted Five Eyes partner, we're able to have a technology agreement, a technology safeguards agreement, which makes these launches for US agencies possible. Another area of cooperation which is more recent is, in the past 2 years, our shared efforts to prevent the showing of extremism or violent extremism or terrorism on the internet. I think everyone would remember the appalling terrorist acts on 2 Christchurch mosques just over 2 years ago in March of 2019. Well, immediately after that, our Prime Minister decided that we had to do something. We had to take an initiative that would prevent the live streaming of that kind of horrific event ever again, or doing our best to prevent it. And so we teamed up with President Macron of France, Jordan, because Jordan had also been very active in this way, and the result was the Christchurch call to action. Now, initially, this was quite a unique approach because it brought together the big US tech companies who provide the internet platforms. It brought together governments who were active in this area, and it brought in civil society. Now, at first, it wasn't possible for the US to sign on to this initiative, although they were supportive of its goals and made supportive statements. But these hesitations have now been overcome, and we were very delighted just a few weeks ago to welcome the United States as a new supporter of the Christchurch call to action, which will really strengthen it. Another area that we are very grateful actually for US cooperation on is cybersecurity. Now, this has been hugely in the news here in the US, of course, in recent times. We're all suffering, it seems, increasingly regular and increasingly serious cyber attacks. Last year, cyber attacks brought down the New Zealand Stock Exchange for a number of days. And just more recently, the Waikato hospital system has been compromised with a lot of consequences. So we in New Zealand are really, really grateful to be able to work very, very tightly with the US system to help us to forecast when these attacks are going to happen, to help us to deal with them when they do. And we really benefit from the much bigger and better resourced US resources in this cyber sphere. I just finish up before we move on to questions on the question of the impact of the pandemic. As we all know, absolutely far-reaching and probably going to change quite a good number of aspects of the way we live in future. In the world of diplomacy, as in business, we've had to learn how to do things differently. Even now in Washington, we're still not able to return to normal face-to-face meetings with State Department or with the National Security Council. Some places are more open than others. At least in our embassy, we're very pleased to be able to return to face-to-face work, no masks. Until Tuesday, we were still wearing masks indoors in the embassy, but we've moved on from that. And I'm sure you've all experienced the frustrations having to work on Zoom, having to make new connections by virtual means, by indirect means, just how much harder it is to establish those relationships of trust that we depend on in really every aspect of our work and our private lives. However, despite those constraints at the embassy, we feel we've been able to continue to punch out our policy work, and we're in the way of building a pretty good and broad-based network of contacts with the Biden administration, even despite the fact that a good number of those still have to be done virtually. I must say I have been super impressed at how very well our New Zealand businesses established in the US have been able to adapt and how well they've done. I know Jeremy is much more familiar with how this has happened amongst the West Coast businesses. And I've understood from Jeremy that really they've all been fairly satisfied with the way they've been able to weather the pandemic storm, as it were, particularly those companies who are invested in the health and welfare area that became so much more important for everybody over the past year. And certainly my New Zealand trade and enterprise colleagues here and on the West Coast confirm that there's a growing interest in the US market from New Zealand companies still keen to come here to move in to find their place in this very, very important market. There's been a few gloomy stories. Of course, it hasn't been equally as good for everybody, and some businesses have struggled. But by and large, I think the record has been good, especially for those who've been able to move quickly into the digital area or were already there, or who've been able to pivot to online marketing and direct-to-consumer marketing. Just want to sort of finish off on some of the good things that happened. I suppose if you look hard enough, I think I heard at the climate summit, President Biden said, he quoted his mother, he said his mother always used to say, even with something very bad, if you looked hard enough, you could find something good. Well, in the pandemic period, there were some good stories for New Zealand business, two of our really big ones. Fonterra, for example, was asked about last April, when the infection rates were still soaring, was asked by their agent here to produce a huge order of a very specialized milk powder called whey hydrolysates, which are used in liquid protein feed for food, I should say, for ICU patients. And this was a request from a whole range of US hospitals. Well, Fonterra was about to close their season. They were about to shut down, mothball for the season, their factory that produced whey hydrolysates. But in response to this urgent appeal, they kept the factory going a whole month longer, produced this massive order, filled up an entire 757 charter flight, and sent it off to Chicago for distribution. So we like to think that New Zealand might have helped to save a few of those very critically ill people in ICU. And the other company that became, even more sought after here, of course, was Fisher & Paykel Healthcare. They've been very long-standing suppliers of specialized respiratory equipment to US hospitals and clinics, but their orders, of course, surged in the response to the pandemic. So just to finish on those two little interesting stories of good things for New Zealand that happened out of a very bad thing for the whole world. So let me stop there and turn it over to Q&A, which is always the best part of these events.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Banks. Before we go into closed sessions, I'm wondering if I might ask a couple of questions, but I can see all the questions coming in, and there are many about all sorts of different subjects. So I'll try and keep these very brief. But I know there is an interest, and it's probably mainly on the part of New Zealanders who have asked me the role of the ambassador in DC. In fact, your talk has gone over so much of that, but just the people with whom you're interacting, acting bilateral versus multilateral, perhaps even the various government departments that are represented in the embassy and so on. I wonder if you might touch on that briefly for us.
Sure, I'll try and keep it short as well. But you know, as an embassy, we're normally around 70 people, 65 to 70, and that includes what we call NZ Inc., you know, New Zealand Incorporated. So all of the agencies who are here, it's not just Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We've also got our New Zealand Defence Force colleagues, we've got immigration, we've got customs, we've got New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, Education New Zealand. So we really are a very joined up team. And once a month we have a joined up conversation with Jeremy and his NZ colleagues on the West Coast. So, you know, people often ask, what do you do as an ambassador? It's quite difficult to explain because you do a whole lot of different things, but I'll make it very specific. I'll tell you what I did today. So today started by planning with one of my MFAT colleagues our next state visit, which we can start to do again. We're allowed to travel. And that'll be to Chicago. That'll be a mixed sort of business and politics, meeting up with New Zealand community kind of visit. Then I had a meeting after that with a defence colleague who's introducing a new member of the defence team. Then I sat down with another internal contact and we talked about a digital trade event that's coming up. Then I hosted a sandwich lunch for two people from the US intelligence community, one of whom stationed in New Zealand. So he was back here, you know, just talking about the relationship, getting himself around Washington. This afternoon, a couple of calls back to home base, the mothership, back to Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. One of those talking about future, hopefully future events for the Prime Minister, maybe a future visit, perhaps not till next year, but she certainly made clear publicly that she wants to do that. And then my last task of the day before joining you was to prepare for a climate change working breakfast tomorrow. So you can see just in the spread of one day. Now, normally in a normal time, there would be more external. I maybe would have gone out to meet somebody at the National Security Council or the State Department. We still can't do that. But that just gives you a flavour.
Thank you so much. And as you said, very varied and very broad. One other question, of course, here in the US, we're in the middle of budget negotiations and the infrastructure bill and so on, lots of numbers. But it's interesting that the last Labour budget was presented, we called it the well-being budget. And I've had questions from friends in the US about that. And I'm wondering if perhaps you might go over that with us a little.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, because that's a really interesting thing that I think so far is unique to us. But I won't say we invented it, because actually the concept came out of a study that was done by the OECD at the time that I was actually at the OECD as permanent representative back in 2011. And they did this study called How's Life? And what it attempted to do was to go beyond sort of standard measures of wealth and GDP and you know, spending power, and actually look at how people felt about their lives, how their sense of integration in their communities was, how their mental health was. And so later our Treasury started to work on that and think about, well, maybe there are some points there that we could also bring in. When the Labour government came in 2017, one of the things that they had learned or picked up from focus group work that was done during the campaign period was that what New Zealanders were really asking about and wanted from their government wasn't necessarily the way that the budget was being produced or presented. People were looking more at questions like their environment, their health, the health of their communities. And so to to cut a very long story short, because it took quite a lot of development by Treasury, they came up with a kind of a different framework for both budgeting and for assessing policy success in future. And they were 4 pillars really. The first was the natural environment. How are we dealing with our environment? They called it natural capital. Then human capital, which was, how healthy are people? How able are they to participate in the economy and in social life? The third one was social capital, and that was really how integrated, how happy do people feel in their communities? How competent, how confident do they feel? And the last one was really the sort of more the standard infrastructure kind of stuff. And so that has now actually become the basis of the first budget that was presented that way was in 2019. So we've now presented our third wellbeing budget. And it has excited quite a bit of interest around the world. The first year that it was presented, our Minister of Finance, Grant Robertson, was invited to the spring meeting of the IMF and the World Bank to explain this, how it was going to work and how we were going to measure it and why we'd chosen to do it. So let me stop there. If you want more information, there's a good explanation on the New Zealand Treasury website.
Thank you so much. And now I've seen lots of questions raining in. So I know there are many questions for you, Ambassador, and we'd like to get through as many as possible. We are going to go into closed session now. So the first question I think we have is Keith from Mank to ask.